So welcome everybody to today's SIG testing meeting. My name is Aaron Kirkenberger and I am your host. Today is Tuesday, September 4th. This is the weekly SIG testing meeting being, being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube later. So please smash that subscribe button and like. With that, I will hand over to Hippie Hacker, who is going to present to us today about API Snoop. And if we have some time afterwards, we will talk about a refactoring effort of the E2E framework. Hippie, all you. You are muted right now.
Thanks for that introduction, Aaron. So glad everybody's here today. I'm going to go through just some simple sections of where things have been started and where things are heading with API Snoop project. One of my favorite things that I found is all of the different ways our community generates artifacts and the way that we generate our clusters. It's a very diverse ecosystem. And I've come to really appreciate our continuous integration system provided by the SIG testing and the test info repo. I've gone a lot of different paths and I'm starting to really focus on improving and trying to find a consistent way within SIG testing. Particularly this first item here, the test grid artifacts. I just found out this morning that these are publicly available and have all of the audit logs that we need to process, and they're continuously updated. That is just delightful. I've pulled these pieces in and will continue to do so on an ongoing basis from here forward. I just want to give a shout out to everyone that's been a part of making test grid and all the artifacts available. I think we should look at more ways of integrating this work into our community and seeing meaningful outputs. So what do we do with those logs? We have some code inside of our repo that is just some Python code initially, and if we look at the particular type of headers that are available early on, we can see that we don't have any user agents. It's just a bunch of, we don't know what test is coming in, and we added that a little later. If I go through and we just look at all the, for example, at 1.12 and later, we add this beautiful piece of code for, let's see, where should I put you? Oh, it'll just be one egg, so I'll put you here. This will allow us to see all the user agents. At this point, we only got one, so there's only nothing with the test in there. But if we say grab 1,000 of those, you start to see different user agents, including some from our updated E2E test that, let's make this one, that have the test info. This isn't in our UI yet, but it will be. And it also shows some beautiful information around our tags, like the SIGs and whether they're in node conformance. And we have some other tools to pull all of this out, and we're making like a tag cloud so that you can look at the parts of our community and what we're doing and how they're, which endpoints need attention and which communities could provide that attention. So I'll go ahead and close that out. One thing that I wanted you to note here is that only in 1.12 and later do we have the ability to do this. So I'm going to go over here and bring down just our E2E test, and I'm going to increase this to a whole lot, maybe the whole thing, right? So this is all of the E2E test endpoints that are part of this particular suite. There may be some wrong through the data, I'm not sure, but this is what we gain of value that we need to find a way to backport. So I'm going to go a little bit further into that as we progress down. through these results. This is how we process this information. We go through and we find with the Swagger, the definition, it needs to match the clients of what's communicating to our Kubernetes server. So I just kind of move these around, which one I'm going to look at right now. So we'll look at 11. So I'll put 11 down here at the bottom, and we'll be sure to focus on 11 here. So let me pull this over so you kind of see what happens. I'm just going to evaluate this block, and now when I do that, I'm going to, just for grins, pardon me, it's little mistakes. They're all okay. Learn from them. You can see in the window here that we're going to use load audit from the dev 111 log provided by our beautiful test grid artifacts. And we're going to, that's the first in the audit log there. And the open API ref means the tag inside our Kubernetes repo with which to retrieve the Swagger JSON to do a comparison against. And the last part is what we want to save it to. It'll be there in the UI when we're done. So I'm going to go ahead and run that rather than just echo it. So as you see this run over here, there's some watches and things. What was really cool is just a few days ago, Aaron was able to add some a pull request to help us not focus on endpoints that have been deprecated. We also saw some possible features in OpenAPI 3 and maybe something in 2. Maybe Aaron can speak to that later, where we should probably not just be putting deprecated in the string field or in the descriptions, but there's actually some attributes that would make this a whole lot easier. Let's see. So once we do this puts it inside of a what's it called? LRT, a SQLite database, because it's kind of a complex thing. When we go down to this next spot, it'll run a command to export that to a CSV. We're using some interesting stuff with the D3 library. The simplest way to feed it data currently is to generate a CSV. We probably will not be doing that going forward. We'll be using Node and doing some really fun stuff, but I'll leave that to Zach. He's been picking up a lot of the flow here. So let's see, that generates our CSVs. So I think we're done with this section. So that's how we process the audit logs. One thing that we have now that this all is kind of automated is we should be able to list all of our what is it called? Our test grid artifacts, and we could provide a link from test grid when you click on that test grid artifact for it to do this and generate the graph. That would not be an unreasonable next step. Just so you can kind of see, those artifacts are generated, and the ones that they're not going to have an E2E test, each test inside the logs. We have to do some porting on that. And so I'm going to go through kind of the steps to do that porting. I've forked Kubernetes into the II org on GitHub, and I've provided some branches there for V in the 1.9, 1.10, and 1.11, because they need the backport in order to work. You go ahead and once you've checked that out, you need to build from source. I really dug using Dind, and particularly I'm interested in seeing the work that Ben the Elder has been working on to increase the speed. It is a joy to work with Dind and Kind, especially when you're trying to do many things at once. The speed and iteration loop is meaningful. As we go past the cluster being deployed, we need to be able to run the test. I've found been working with the different parts of the E2E test system. It's great to actually just run the E2E test itself. So you can see in this section here, it actually uses Bazel to generate just the E2E binary And then as long as kubeconfig is set, I'm not sure Ginkgo parallel matters, but as long as kubeconfig is set, the E2E test suite doesn't need any other variables. You need to specify everything on the command line, and it gives a little more precise control while you're trying to do deep level poking around in our test suite. At least from my perspective, I'd love to see what other people are doing in our community. And then the last piece is retrieve the audit logs from the API server. Depending on if you're using Dind or Kind, you can just do a Docker CP to get it out of the container, which is nice. And then, of course, I didn't document it here, but the next steps would be to pull it out of the API server on GCE. So that's kind of our next steps there. And then here's what I needed to do to backport. 112, this is fine. It's great, just go check it out. The next part is the backporting. So this is what I did to do the backport. So those are the branches I made. And there's particular cherry picks we needed to get. The first is the cherry pick for when our E2E tests are running. Be sure to set the user agent per test. It's a pretty small commit, but it was a very hard commit to come by. And I thank everybody who spent hours with me trying to find the best way to communicate a per test thing within our framework. And then the next part was the letting the API server log that as the clients are talking. And that was pretty early on. So we cherry picked those commits, and then we're done. So this is kind of the one-liner. Once we're up, just run kube test, Bazel up, provider go, and again we can do our test. And I would love some feedback. As I said, I've been trying to run the test directly using the EDA test binary. Even with Ginkgo parallel total 8 and all of this, it sometimes runs really slow. And I'm not super familiar with why and how to see that things are running in parallel. But that would be one great thing. I think that's pretty much it for the interactive Cody demo-y bits. The rest of it's just the website, right? So go into the old Chrome and go to API Snoop. Not co-op, that's the old one. It's on the IO. So on IO, that stuff from our, what's it called, the test grid. These are the current test grid artifacts for the GCE test. Sorry?
Do you mind full screening that window?
Sure, do that. Is that better?
That's great, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, and when you mouse, so we can make this do whatever we want, right? But right now, I just used the little short name because it was convenient. You can see that this integrates Aaron's please don't bother us with the deprecated API patch, deprecated endpoints patch, and then, oh, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. And I'm not sure what happened on here on 12. It's probably a data problem. But that's, yeah, it's kind of exciting to see where the numbers are heading. And the possibility for that tag cloud and SIG cloud to be able to say with this SIG tag, which is in the test, but also doing some static analysis and finding which parts of our code base are maintained, like with the owners files, to be able to see when I look at this particular when I look at the community from this particular SIG's perspective, what things might I want to see. And I know that Zach has been looking at automating, adding GitHub login so it knows who you are when you come to look at this, and giving you context and what you might be interested in seeing within our community. So that's kind of it for now. But there's lots more ideas we have on GitHub API Snoop. There is these are projects 2. I think it is projects 2. There's a bunch of different visualization thoughts that it might be interesting to get people's feedback on. There's quite a few actually. Sorry, on this one. So I wanted to show all individual endpoints. Currently, we mouse over. They're not all there. Let's make this bigger. For some reason, my computer's kind of stopped responding. One more time. Yeah, it has stopped responding. Well, that's pretty much it. Go look at the possibilities and vote for your favorites. And we'll go from there. Oh, we want to load audit data. So when we're doing when we moved over to Node, you don't need a web server, right? You'll just load this up in the Kubernetes repo and load your audit log, and it'll just display. It'll be great.
Hi, Hippie Hacker. Quick question. Are you just going against the URL itself and not differentiate? Are you differentiating between get, delete, post, and other verbs?
Yeah,
or are you just going against the URL itself?
No, I count the verb as an endpoint because it's a different thing.
Okay. So we'll be able to tell if we are covering all the verbs for a specific URL, right?
Yeah.
When we
let me mouse over.
when we
You
get
can
to it.
see. Do you see that these? Is it large enough to see? You see it says stable core, get, post, watch, get, post, watch, get, post. It just kind of alternates. Those, and that line represents one endpoint.
Okay.
So we're not necessarily grouping the endpoints together just yet. It might be interesting to group them in. So you see endpoint and then the different verbs that are covered for the endpoint. I don't know.
I think that's one of the UX things here somewhere.
So it's also worth calling out that Catherine, who's on the call here, like I give full credit, just to say it on the video, like I give full credit to her for the deprecation and verb filtering stuff. I ported it over from a view that she contributed that was more table-based, allowing you to drill down to each specific component of the endpoint if we find we need to differentiate between more than just alpha, beta, stable, or what group the endpoint belongs to. And I'm still kind of in the midst of sussing this data out, but yeah, I agree. It's been really interesting to see this progress forward. We're using this for now as kind of a guiding light on conformance test coverage efforts, but it's not necessarily our prime driver. Like we're not about to go write a test that CRUDs every single endpoint just to make that go up. That's kind of the wrong direction, but it does kind of help us make sense of what API endpoints are we covering, and for Kubernetes as a whole, is its API surface area generally trending more towards stability, beta or alpha, stuff like that. So
how is this handling resources that have, I don't know, for instance, 2 beta versions, beta 1, beta 2?
I believe at the present, it just lumps them all together because it has the word beta in it.
Yeah.
Another piece of feedback I would give is that while it's cool that we are now checking the Swagger, or checking out, comparing against the open API spec that matches up with the client and server that we're talking to, I think maybe it would be worth considering whether we should adjust our continuous integration to dump the Swagger JSON from the cluster under test directly into the artifacts directory to pull from that instead of having to go refer to a branch or a ref in GitHub. Because I notice as we import those logs, there are a couple endpoints that aren't really covered or captured right now. I personally haven't had the time to dig into why, like the metrics and scaling endpoints seem to be errors in importing logs and stuff. So,
hey, Aaron, could I ask a question about the previous comment you made that you don't want to just have vanilla tests of the CRUD?
Yes.
Just for the purpose of getting the coverage up? Are you certain that it doesn't make sense to do that? I mean, certainly not as the endpoint, but it does seem like just a really generic test against the OpenAPI definitions would catch some just like screw ups by potentially some of the vendors.
I have seen an issue to that effect pop up in the past where it would guarantee whether or not an API is responsive or present, but that sort of test wouldn't necessarily guarantee that the functionality behind that API is in any way, shape, or form meaningful. So I don't think it's useful as a driver for conformance testing. It could be a very interesting use of API Snoop as a tool to encourage further development. But I think in terms of exercising the behavior of a Kubernetes cluster for conformance, it's not ideal.
One of the things.
My question is just whether it's even worth doing. You wouldn't count it towards these percentages. I mean, if you could imagine writing a test framework that just says we're going to test 100% of the CRUD verbs that are mentioned under OpenAPI.
And I guess I'm just articulating that my concern is you could then run that test against another kind of script that just generically responds to all of those endpoints. You wouldn't actually be confirming whether or not the thing that's on the other side of those endpoints is a Kubernetes cluster or not.
Agreed. So you don't feel like it would catch, just writing those tests would catch meaningful bad behavior. I think Tim has his hand raised.
Yeah, Aaron is echoing everything I would say, so it's good. The other comment I wanted to make with regards to a comment that Steve made, if you actually track API deprecation policy with some of this, you'll find that we don't follow our own policies. We actually have a bunch of stale alpha and beta APIs that have existed for way too long, even though the APIs have graduated well beyond their life cycle. So we actually have, if you look inside the code, we have like up to 5 layers of conversioning that is still somehow supported. And the fact that it even works actually amazes me. So I don't know if we should somehow raise that with API machinery or whatnot, but you'll find that some of your alpha and beta numbers will be weirdly conflating and probably are not indicative of what should be the truth.
That seems fair. And that sort of gets to where I think this tool or something that consumes this data is going to continue to be useful for us, is to help us highlight, okay, great, so we're seeing a number move in a general direction, but like how are the endpoints shifting along, and how much duplication do we have of endpoints across versions and things like that. So I don't necessarily think this drives conformance testing. Like I said, I just think it's a useful indicator, but I do think it could help us prioritize good API hygiene going forward. So with that, we only kind of have 4 minutes left over. I really apologize to Patrick if you want to try just walking us through your proposal on refactoring E2E framework. You are welcome to, or we can punt that to next week to have a more substantive discussion. Completely up to you.
Well, we can get started.
Sure.
Basically, I want to move forward with this proposal. There is something that can be discussed either in Google Docs or in the corresponding issue that I created a while back, and Tim also kind of already leave some comments, but I thought that bringing this to this audience here might be a faster way to make progress. So just to recap, my motivation is to make the existing test E2E framework also usable outside of Kubernetes, outside of the Kubernetes repository. I tried importing it into some other project as it is today with deb, and it failed miserably because of all the long dependency chains that are caused by the current framework and all the different providers that it pulls into this one package that exists at the moment. So I think there is a need for that. I've seen that both in my own project. I'm working on a CSI driver that eventually needs some kind of end-to-end testing. I've seen it in the Kubernetes SIG storage, which currently has unit testing for its CSI components, but not really end-to-end testing outside this one test that is in Kubernetes core. But we hope, and I'm working with a SIG on that, we hope to expand that test set to come up with more different scenarios, and then make those tests available also to other CSI driver implementers. But yeah, in the current state, people apparently either write their own framework for doing end-to-end testing with Kubernetes, or they somehow do it with the current framework, but it's certainly not ideal. And looking at the code, there are also various other to-do items from past years, like the Viper configuration handling, which kind of got started 2 years ago, but then hasn't progressed much. And that again, this whole partial implementation of Viper support leads to questions that people have that want to write tests. I ran into that myself when I added some configuration option for the existing SIG storage test for CSI. I had a command line parameter added as a flag inside the test itself, and then I was asked to move it to the central framework, which just, in my opinion, is the wrong place for it. So my proposal is to do a code refactoring, and my goal was to do it in a way that keeps the existing behavior of the end-to-end test binary unchanged as much as possible. And I think it's doable to just keep the existing command line options, which is primarily the interface that people are probably concerned about. And also don't change the source code too much and still have some meaningful subdivision into different packages, which then can be imported more easily into a foreign repository. My Google Doc that I created that has some proposal, and there's actually a prototype branch that I created to try out this idea. I think it's working. It's doable. My open question really is how we move forward with that. Tim was suggesting that the long-term goal should be, for example, to completely replace the existing or current set of command line parameters with something that fits better into a hierarchical Viper configuration file. And while I do agree with that goal, it's not exactly something that I personally would like to undertake at this time, because that would be very disruptive and would make it hard to achieve my primary goal, which is just the code reorganization.
So I think, like, my personal opinion is there are many people who want to see E2E framework refactored. There are many things wrong with it. I would hate for scope creep to pile in on you. So if I look at your doc and I see that your first goal is to be able to import E2E framework as a vendor dependency without pulling in the entire world, thus enabling people to use that framework out of tree to write their own tests, I think that is laudable and an appropriate initial scope for MVP. I think everything else you list sounds cool. I really only care about that first bullet point happening successfully. The rest of the stuff, I would all punt to nice to have. And I would also apologize for not engaging with this, because I feel as strongly as Tim does that it is super awesome that you were working on this. I personally have been heads down on other efforts, and we're also entering into code freeze. So I think getting you to a place where you are ready to start ramping up on this as part of the 113 timeframe would be ideal. Because what I think would be not ideal to happen is to somehow end up mid-refactor when we cut 113.
Okay, well, I think that's all doable. The initial goals, also around Viper, that's all doable. I personally think that I do have it working, except that I haven't changed the command line parameters. That would be then a next step. It does fit into the overall design. It just means that the flags need to follow some certain naming scheme with a dot, for example, to separate different levels. And then I already have one commit which takes the existing parameters and maps them to Viper. So Viper basically pulls from these hierarchical command line arguments, and then you have full Viper configuration file support. So I don't see any big blockers. If we agree that this is a good first step, then I'll just proceed with the implementation, and we'll eventually submit a pull request after the current release is done. It certainly doesn't, it's not material for the current one, but after, yeah, definitely.
When you're nearing the end of the release cycle, it doesn't hurt to push up a whip near the end if people aren't too busy, just to say work in progress, please give feedback. Because sometimes if it's a large PR, it can take a number of rounds to get through the cycle. Or you might want to refactor it into breaking up into individual discrete pieces that are easier to review. That's always the best for a project of this size.
Yeah. At this point, it's individual commits, and it starts so that the first ones could be taken without breaking anything. And I started creating some pull requests for removing that code in the end-to-end tests already. So yeah, I think I'm doing that. That shouldn't be an issue, and I can do a work in progress pull request, like you said, probably next week, I guess.
Maybe if you can create a tracking issue or something, so we can kind of keep up.
There is a tracking issue. That's 66649, and it's cross-referenced in the Google Doc. Both link to each other.
Okay, I super appreciate you bringing this to the group. I apologize that we ran late to walk through this, but I think it was worthwhile. I would say, like, so the number one thing I would like to avoid is you've done a great job of putting together this proposal and doing some work. I would hate for somebody to swoop in and say, whoa, what are you doing? Like, this is a bad idea because X, Y, and Z. And I can tell that Tim is trying to make sure you get this idea sufficiently shopped around to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
I haven't taken enough of a look to really have strong opinions on it. I'll make sure I can try and send it around to those who might.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I appreciate the comments that I got from Tim. It certainly took the whole thing in the right direction. It's just really a question of how far this needs to go before it can become a pull request. And I think we've clarified that. So I think that's good.
Yeah, I would say, I would add to what has been told before. Reviewability is important, and the smaller the initial patch, the better chances are, this is like, when you're flying in an airplane, you're changing the components, right? So yeah, that would be the important part. And, definitely if it's a very big piece of work, then it's going to be really hard to backport and all that as well.
Yeah, I don't think backporting will work that well there, because people are continuing to change the tests. There are some trivial code conflicts, nothing major, because not that much happens at the framework itself. But because I need to move code around, yeah, there is a risk of code conflicts.
Right. And when you get to the point where you need to deal with the providers, ping me. I'll be happy to help.
I've already moved the provider-specific code into these packages as I suggested, so that wasn't too hard. The testing side is a bit more difficult because I don't have access to all of the providers. But then again, the change itself is just really moving code around, so I hope I didn't break too much. But we will see.
When you do the PR, it will force the testing of all the providers. So
yeah, I'm sure it will.
It won't necessarily test all of them, right? Like, we don't have an OpenStack pre-submit, for example, but it'll walk us through some of them.
Some of them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that was enough for me today. And thanks for the opportunity to come here and talk.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, Patrick. And thanks so much for everybody's time. Again, sorry for us running long, and thank you to Hippie and Zach for the API Snoop demo. Have a happy Tuesday, everybody. See you next week.
Happy Tuesday.